The laughter died in their throats, the cocky smirks melting into masks of pure shock. The woman they had just dismissed as a paper pusher was staring back at them from a place they never imagined she could be. They didn't know her real story, they didn't know the secrets she carried, and they certainly didn't know that this single image would shatter their entire world. But before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Anchor's Rest was a place that clung to the coast like a barnacle, weathering storms both literal and metaphorical. Located just a stone's throw from a major naval base, it was a classic dive bar in every sense of the word. The air inside was a thick, heady cocktail of sea salt blown in from the nearby docks, the greasy perfume of fried food from a perpetually busy kitchen, and the unmistakable aroma of decades of spilled beer that had seeped into the very grain of the wooden floorboards, rendering them permanently sticky. The walls were a chaotic museum of maritime history and local pride, covered in faded photographs of hulking gray ships, signed portraits of decorated officers, and various pieces of military memorabilia donated by patrons over the years. It was a Thursday night, and the place was humming with the kinetic energy of off-duty personnel, eager to wash away the stresses of the week. The low thrum of conversations, punctuated by sharp bursts of laughter and the clatter of pool balls, was all set to the soundtrack of a jukebox blasting rock anthems from the 1980s. Tucked away in a shadowed corner, far from the boisterous epicenter of the bar, Lydia Holt sat alone at a small, wobbly table. She was nursing a single bottle of beer, taking slow, deliberate sips as she watched the chaotic ballet of the crowd. In her late 20s, she was dressed in a uniform of deliberate anonymity, simple, well-worn jeans and a gray sweater that had no distinguishing marks or logos. Her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and her face, devoid of makeup, was pleasant but easily forgettable. She could have been a librarian, an accountant, or a graduate student, anyone but who she actually was. She looked like someone designed to be overlooked, and that was precisely the point. The noise of the bar, a cacophony that would have been grating to most, was a welcome blanket for her. It was a loud, vibrant distraction that allowed her to dissolve into the background, to become anonymous. She took another small sip of her beer, a faint, ironic smile touching her lips. Her days were spent in the sterile, silent world of a sensitive, compartmented information facility, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with pressure and secrets. In that world, a single keystroke, a flicker of data on a screen, could have monumental consequences for people operating thousands of miles away. It was a realm of high stakes, silent tension, where every decision carried immense weight. Her nights, on the rare occasions she allowed herself to have them, were spent in pursuit of the absolute opposite. She sought out loud, chaotic normality, places like the Anchor's Rest, where she was nobody important, just another face in the crowd. Here, the only stakes were whether the jukebox would play your song next. The contrast was a necessary valve, a way to decompress and remember what the world outside the secure walls sounded and felt like. It was a fragile piece, but it was hers. That piece was shattered when the heavy wooden door of the bar swung open with a force that made the glasses behind the counter rattle. A palpable shift in energy swept through the room, a wave of boisterous, unadulterated confidence that commanded the attention of everyone present. A group of Navy SEALs had arrived. They moved with a coordinated physical assurance that spoke of intense training and an unbreakable bond. Leading the pack was a man who wore his arrogance like a second skin, Jake Riley, known to his team as Wrecker. He was handsome in a rugged, chiseled way, with a physique that seemed carved from granite and a swagger that announced his status before he ever said a word. He was fully and unapologetically aware of the legendary aura his gold trident insignia afforded him, and he used it to its full effect. Their laughter was a booming counterpoint to the jukebox, easily overpowering the music as they slapped each other on the back and made their way to the bar. "Round of shots for the boys." Wrecker's voice cut through the din, and the bartender, accustomed to their presence, immediately began lining up glasses. Their conversation was a rapid-fire volley of inside jokes, technical jargon from recent training exercises, and shared memories that were impenetrable to any outsider. They were the undisputed kings of this small coastal world, apex predators in a pond of lesser fish, and every single person in the bar, from the grizzled fisherman at the end of the counter to the young sailors trying to look tough, knew it and afforded them a wide berth. They owned the space they occupied, and their presence turned the volume of the entire establishment up to 11. As the team, now armed with shots of whiskey, made their way toward the pool tables at the back of the bar, one of the younger members, a SEAL named Diaz, misjudged his step. He stumbled, his arm flailing out to catch his balance, and collided squarely with Lydia's small table. The impact sent her half-full beer bottle skittering across the surface before it toppled over, its remaining contents gushing out in a wave of amber foam that soaked a stack of napkins and began to drip onto the floor. Before Diaz could even stammer out a proper apology, Jake stepped in, a predatory smirk already playing on his lips. "Whoa there, Diaz. Watch where you're going," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Can't you see you're disturbing the civilian?" He then turned his full charismatic attention to Lydia, his eyes doing a quick, dismissive scan. "Sorry about that. Let me buy you another." As he spoke, his gaze drifted down, catching the faint, rectangular outline of her ID badge, which she had clipped to the inside waistband of her jeans for safekeeping. It was barely visible, but his eyes were trained to notice details. He leaned in, feigning a deep, sincere curiosity that was entirely false. "What we got here?" he murmured, his face close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. He hooked a finger under the clip and pulled it out just enough to read the text. "Naval Base Coronado. Logistics Clerk. Lydia Holt." He straightened up, the smirk widening into a look of patronizing amusement. He held his hands up as if presenting a grand prize. "A logistics clerk," he announced to his team, who were now gathering around, sensing an opportunity for entertainment. "You count the widgets, right? Make sure all the pencils are sharp?" Lydia felt a familiar, deep-seated weariness wash over her. This was not the first time she had had this exact conversation, or a variation of it. The condescension was as predictable as the tides. She kept her expression carefully, painstakingly neutral, though a flicker of profound exhaustion crossed her eyes for just a moment before she extinguished it. Years of training in maintaining cover, in managing her emotional responses, kicked in like a second nature. Reacting would only escalate the situation, draw more attention, and potentially compromise the very anonymity she craved. "Something like that," she replied, her voice quiet but firm, betraying none of the internal frustration that was beginning to simmer. "Don't worry about the drink. It's fine." But Jake wasn't the type to be deterred by a polite dismissal. He was having fun. He saw a target, and he was enjoying the sport. He gestured grandly to his friends, who were now forming a loose, intimidating circle around her small table. "Hear that, boys? We got a real operator in here," he said, his voice dripping with mock reverence. "She makes sure we have enough paper clips to win the war." The group of SEALs erupted in a chorus of deep, rumbling chuckles. It wasn't malicious, not in their minds. It was just harmless ribbing, the kind of teasing they subjected each other to constantly. They didn't see the power imbalance, the casual cruelty in mocking someone they perceived as being on a lower rung of the military hierarchy. Lydia's internal monologue was a silent scream of frustration. She was so tired of it, so tired of the endless condescension, of the reflexive assumption that her role, because it didn't involve a gun and a parachute, was trivial and unimportant. She thought of the complex logistical matrices she managed, the life, or death supply chains she oversaw, the sheer intellectual firepower it took to ensure that men like Jake had the tools they needed when they needed them. In the most hostile environments on Earth, the gulf between their perception of her as a paper pusher and the reality of her responsibilities was a vast, unbridgeable ocean. But her training was a formidable shield. She had spent years learning to compartmentalize, to build walls within her own mind. She knew that reacting, showing anger, or trying to defend herself would be a victory for them. It would give them the emotional response they were goading her for. So she held onto her quiet confidence, the secret knowledge of what she really did, and used it as her armor. She met Jake's amused gaze with a look of placid indifference, a blank canvas onto which he could project whatever he wanted. Her stillness was her strength, a silent defiance that he was too arrogant to even recognize. Jake and his team, having thoroughly enjoyed their little display of dominance, settled into a large, circular table near the pool tables, their laughter still echoing in the rafters. They saw their interaction with Lydia not as malicious, but as harmless fun, a bit of sport at the expense of someone who existed outside their elite, rarefied circle. Having dismissed her from their minds as anything more than a momentary diversion, they launched into the real business of the night, which was reinforcing their own legends. They told loud, wildly exaggerated stories of their missions, each tale a carefully constructed monument to their own bravery and skill. The stories were full of bravado and heroism, painting a vivid picture of a world defined by constant danger and split-second decisions. Implicit in every word was a stark, unstated contrast between their perilous lives and what they imagined Lydia's existence to be: a mundane, soul-crushingly boring 9-to-5 cycle of spreadsheets and inventory forms. "Remember that time in the Hindu Kush, when we were completely out of C4? Jake's voice boomed across the room, pitched just loud enough to ensure it carried over the jukebox and reached Lydia's corner table. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of casual confidence. Had to improvise with some local fertilizer and a roll of duct tape. Made a beautiful bang. His friends roared with appreciative laughter, slapping the table. Jake glanced over at Lydia, a patronizing grin spreading across his face. "I bet your logistics manual doesn't cover that, huh? Lydia?" Section 4, paragraph 3. Improvised explosives for dummies. The laughter from his table intensified. Lydia, who had since been brought a glass of water by a sympathetic bartender, took a slow, deliberate sip. She didn't look at them. Her gaze was fixed on the condensation trailing down the side of her glass, but her mind was miles and years away, back in the sterile, chilled air of the skiff. She remembered the mission Jake was referencing, not the fictionalized, testosterone-fueled version he was currently performing, but the actual, terrifying reality of it. She remembered the real-time satellite imagery she had been analyzing for 72 hours straight, her eyes burning from staring at the screen. She remembered the faint, almost imperceptible thermal signatures of an enemy patrol, a ghost on the edge of their sensor grid, moving to intercept Jake's team. She remembered the frantic, silent calculations, the cross-referencing of topographical data and enemy movement patterns. It was her analysis, her decision, that had allowed her to subtly reroute a predator drone, creating a false target that drew the patrol away, giving Jake's team the narrow 60-second window they needed to plant their charges and get out. And the C4, the improvised C4, was a complete fiction, a piece of barroom bravado. She remembered the frantic alert that their supply was critically low, the panic that had rippled through the command center. She had been the one to personally override 3 levels of protocol, bullying and cajoling a supply depot chief in Germany to get an emergency resupply pallet loaded onto a C-17 that was already on the tarmac. She had tracked its flight path across 3 continents, her fingers flying across the keyboard, ensuring it arrived at the forward operating base with less than an hour to spare. Jake's team had what they needed because she had bent the entire global logistics network of the United States military to her will. The gulf between their perception of her and her reality was not just an ocean. It was a different universe entirely. She was the architect of their success, the invisible hand guiding them through the darkness, and they were laughing at her for counting paperclips. She took another sip of water, the cold liquid a small grounding anchor in a sea of bitter irony. The raucous noise of the bar, which had been a constant rolling wave of sound, suddenly began to recede. The sports recap playing on the multiple television screens scattered around the room was abruptly cut off. A bold red and white banner flashed across the screens, reading "Special Report." The familiar, serious face of a national news anchor appeared, his expression grave. The general din of the bar quieted down slightly, the conversations dipping in volume as patrons turned their heads toward the nearest screen. In a town built around the Navy, breaking news from the wider world of military operations was more than just news, it was local industry. Some watched with a detached, professional interest, analyzing the report for operational details. Others watched with a more casual curiosity, another story of faraway conflict to be consumed between sips of beer. At the SEALs table, the boisterous laughter had ceased. They listened intently, a collective flicker of pride in their eyes. This was their world being discussed on the national stage, the world of shadows and high stakes that they alone inhabited. "We are interrupting this program with breaking news." The anchor's voice was crisp and authoritative, filling the now hushed bar. "Sources within the Pentagon have confirmed details of the highly successful, and until now, deeply classified Operation Nightfall, which resulted in the capture of a top-tier terrorist leader in North Africa 2 months ago. Jake leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. He exchanged a knowing look with Diaz. They knew about Nightfall. They hadn't been on the ground for that one, but they knew the team that had been. It was Devgru, the best of the best. A quiet pride settled over their table. This was a victory for the Brotherhood. The anchor continued, his voice narrating over stock footage of a military transport plane taking off at dusk. The mission, carried out by elements of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, has been hailed as a flawless victory, a textbook example of surgical special operations. However, the story has taken a controversial turn in the last hour, with the leak of a single, unauthorized photograph from inside the Tactical Operations Center during the raid. The stock footage vanished, and the screen was filled with a single, grainy, chaotic image. It was clearly taken with a cell phone, a stolen moment from a place no civilian was ever meant to see. The quality was poor, the lighting was terrible, but the scene was electrifying. In the foreground, two medics in tactical gear were frantically working on a wounded operator who lay on a cot, his face contorted in pain. The background was a tangled web of cables, servers, and high-tech equipment, a digital nerve center humming with unseen power. And in the middle of it all, bathed in the eerie green light of a dozen different monitors, stood a figure. It was a woman. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, severe bun, and her face, a mask of absolute unwavering concentration, was illuminated by the streams of data scrolling across the screens in front of her. Her left hand was a pale blur of motion over a specialized keyboard, while her right hand was raised, her index finger pointing with decisive, unhesitating authority at a specific point on a glowing, three-dimensional digital map. A profound hush fell over the entire bar. Every conversation stopped. The only sound was the hum of the beer coolers and the voice of the news anchor. At Jake's table, the smug pride had evaporated, replaced by slack, jawed disbelief. Diaz, the youngest of the team, squinted at the screen, his brow furrowed in confusion. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It can't be." Jake was staring, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The woman on the screen, the one at the very heart of the chaos, the calm center of the storm, looked familiar, impossibly, maddeningly familiar. As if on cue, the camera on the news report began to zoom in, the production team enhancing the face of the woman in the background, sharpening the grainy pixels into a clear, undeniable image. The face that filled the screen, the face illuminated by the cold, green light of classified data, the face that held the fate of the entire mission in its focused gaze, was Lydia Holt's. The blood drained from Jake's face. It felt as if the floor of the bar had dropped out from under him. The logistics clerk, the widget counter, the woman he had just spent the last 10 minutes mocking and patronizing, the woman he had dismissed as a civilian paper pusher, was standing at the digital heart of Operation Nightfall, one of the most critical and dangerous special operations in recent history. She wasn't counting paper clips, she was directing the tip of the spear. Lydia, in her quiet corner, did not react to the screen. She had not looked at it once. She slowly, deliberately, finished the last of her water. She placed the empty glass down on the table, and the soft click it made in the deafening silence of the bar sounded like a gunshot. She stood up, her movements fluid and unhurried. She slung her simple bag over her shoulder and for the first time, glanced over at Jake's table. Her eyes, calm and unreadable, met his for a fraction of a second. There was no triumph in her gaze, no anger, no "I told you so." There was nothing. It was the same placid, neutral expression she had worn when he was calling her a widget counter. And that, somehow, was the most devastating response of all. She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps silent on the sticky floor. The door swung shut behind her, leaving a profound and suffocating silence in her wake. Jake was left staring at the empty doorway, the image of her calm face superimposed over the image of her on the television screen. A feeling of deep, burning, and utterly complete shame washed over him, so intense it felt like a physical blow. He had never felt so small, so ignorant, so profoundly and comprehensively wrong in his entire life. The laughter had died in his throat, and in its place was the bitter taste of his own arrogance. Sunlight, sharp and unforgiving, sliced through the cheap blinds of Jake's sparse apartment, illuminating a million dancing dust motes in the stale air. An empty bottle of whiskey stood sentinel on the kitchen counter, a silent testament to a night spent wrestling with ghosts. Jake woke up, his head pounding with the familiar dull ache of a hangover, but the physical discomfort was a gentle whisper compared to the roaring inferno of his guilt. The image of Lydia Holt's face was burned into his memory, a haunting double exposure. First, there was the face on the television screen, a warrior goddess bathed in the green glow of tactical monitors, her expression one of absolute, focused command. Then, there was the face in the bar, quiet, patient, and enduring his smug condescension with a stoicism he now understood was not weakness, but monumental strength. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images remained, playing on a loop against the dark screen of his eyelids. He replayed his own words, his patronizing tone, his smug, self-satisfied laughter. "You count the widgets, right?" The phrase echoed in his skull, each syllable a fresh jab of humiliation. He had stood there, a king in his own small kingdom, and mocked the very person who made his world possible. He felt like a complete and utter fool, a child playing with toy soldiers who had just stumbled into the real war room and been shown how insignificant his games truly were. This wasn't just embarrassment, a simple loss of face. This was a seismic shock to the foundations of his identity. His entire understanding of the military structure, of who the warriors were and who the support staff were, had been violently upended. He had always seen the world in binary terms, the operators and everyone else, the tip of the spear and the people who sharpened it. He had never once considered that the person sharpening the spear might be wielding a weapon far more powerful and complex than his own. The thought left him feeling hollowed out, the arrogance that had been his armor for so long now feeling like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. He dragged himself out of bed, the morning light feeling like an accusation, and knew this was a stain that no amount of whiskey could wash away. Later that morning, Jake stood before the office of his commanding officer, Captain Wallace. The door was polished wood, the nameplate a simple, severe brass rectangle. It was an intimidating portal. Taking a deep breath, Jake smoothed down his uniform and knocked. Inside, the office was the man personified, neat, organized, and radiating a quiet, unyielding authority. Captain Wallace, a seasoned officer with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, looked up from a mountain of paperwork. Jake attempted a casual, nonchalant approach, a friendly chat between colleagues. "Morning, Captain," he began, forcing a relaxed smile. "Crazy story on the news last night about Operation Nightfall. Real textbook victory." Captain Wallace's sharp eyes held his for a moment. "I saw," he said, his tone flat, offering no opening. Jake pressed on, feeling the sweat begin to prickle on his neck. He tried to sound merely curious, a professional taking an interest in the finer points of his trade. That analyst in the photo, the woman, just curious what her role was. Seems unusual to have someone like that so deep in the TOC during a live op. The shift was instantaneous and chilling. Wallace leaned back in his chair, and his expression, previously neutral, turned to stone. The friendly captain was gone, replaced by the cold, hard commander of a Tier 1 unit. "First, Wrecker," Wallace began, his voice dangerously soft. "You didn't see that photo. As of 0800 this morning, that image is classified at a level far above your clearance. Its leak is now a criminal matter being handled by the highest levels of the intelligence community. So, to be clear, you saw nothing." Second, the role of personnel attached to the Naval Special Warfare Development Group is, and will always be, on a strict need-to-know basis, and you, son, do not need to know. Wallace leaned forward, the full weight of his authority pressing down on Jake. His voice dropped to a low, serious tone that tolerated no argument. "I hear whispers, Riley. The grapevine on this base is efficient. I know you and your team were at the Anchor's Rest last night." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "My advice to you, my official and only advice, is to forget you saw anything. Forget that woman's face, forget you ever heard the name Lydia Holt, and from this day forward, you will treat every single person on this base, from the janitor who cleans the latrines to the admiral himself, with the respect their position demands. You have no idea who you are talking to or what they are responsible for. Are we clear? A chill, cold and sharp as ice, ran down Jake's spine. This was more than a simple brush-off. It was a direct order and a stern, unambiguous warning. The hammer had come down, hard. He felt his posture straighten reflexively, his body snapping to attention. "Crystal clear, Captain," he said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. He turned and walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind him with an air of finality. He left feeling smaller than he had in his entire life. Stripped of his pride and put firmly in his place by a truth he was not even allowed to acknowledge. Miles away, in a world that Jake Riley could not even imagine, Lydia Holt was in her element. She stood at the head of a polished conference table inside a sensitive compartmented information facility. There were no windows in this room, no connection to the outside world save for the encrypted data streams that fed the massive, wall-sized screens. The walls were soundproofed, the air kept at a constant, cool temperature, humming with the quiet, powerful thrum of servers and cooling fans. This was Lydia's real office, the silent, sterile heart of modern warfare. She was not counting paperclips. She was briefing a group of grim-faced colonels and seasoned intelligence officers on an emerging threat in the Strait of Hormuz. She spoke with a calm, quiet authority that belied her age, her voice a steady, confident instrument. Her presentation was a dense, complex tapestry of data, weaving together real, time satellite imagery, signals intelligence intercepts, and human intelligence reports into a single, coherent picture. She moved between the complex technical details of Iranian naval capabilities and the broad strategic implications of their posturing with an effortless, breathtaking precision. The men in the room, all of whom outranked her by decades and pay grades, listened with rapt attention. In this room, her youth and gender were irrelevant. Her unassuming appearance was meaningless. The only thing that mattered was the clarity of her analysis and the power of her intellect. She was the expert, and they were her students. After the briefing, as the officers filed out, murmuring amongst themselves, a colleague, a balding man named David who managed their internal security, approached her. "Got a flag on your file, Lydia," he said in a low voice, not looking directly at her. "An informal inquiry was made this morning. Came down from a Captain Wallace over at Spec War on behalf of one of his SEALs, a Master Chief Riley." He paused. It was denied, obviously, and the inquiry was logged and shut down so hard I think it left a crater. Lydia showed no outward reaction. She simply gave a short, sharp nod as she gathered her tablet. Internally, however, a wave of profound annoyance washed over her. The photo leak was already a major headache. It was an unacceptable breach of security that had forced her entire unit to begin the arduous process of changing protocols and updating security measures. Now, this. It was a complication she didn't need, a loose thread in a world that demanded absolute, unwavering control. She wasn't angry at the SEAL, Jake. On some level, she understood his curiosity. He had been confronted with a reality that shattered his worldview, and he was trying to make sense of it. But his curiosity was a liability. It was a spotlight drifting dangerously close to the shadows where she was required to live and work. She thought about the constant, draining effort it took to maintain the two separate identities, the two separate lives. There was Lydia Holt, the high-level analyst, a ghost in the machine known only to a select, powerful few. And then there was Lydia Holt, the bland, forgettable logistics clerk, a carefully constructed fiction designed to allow her to move through the outside world without notice. The strain of keeping those two people separate, of ensuring one never bled into the other, was immense. Jake Riley's clumsy inquiry was a threat to that separation, and as she walked out of the silent, cold conference room, she felt a familiar sense of weariness settle over her. The price of her secret life was a loneliness and a vigilance that never, ever slept. In a sterile, windowless room deep within the Pentagon, a new crisis was blooming in cold, hard data. The air, chilled to a precise 68 degrees, hummed with the silent power of immense computational resources. On a vast wall-sized screen, complex streams of information flowed like digital rivers, a torrent of intercepts, satellite feeds, and network traffic analysis that painted a terrifying picture. A new, urgent threat had materialized, emerging from the shadows of a rogue nation long known for its aggressive pursuit of asymmetrical warfare capabilities. They had achieved a breakthrough that the world's intelligence agencies had dreaded for over a decade, a new form of quantum, encrypted communication. The data on the screen showed elegant, impossibly complex algorithms folding in on themselves, creating a cryptographic shield that was, for all intents and purposes, unbreakable. Every attempt to penetrate it had failed, the most powerful decryption programs bouncing off its surface like pebbles off a battleship's hull. The nation was using this newfound invulnerability to coordinate a sprawling network of terrorist cells for a major, synchronized attack on civilian infrastructure across 3 continents. Intelligence had managed, through a high-risk human asset, to identify the architect of this digital ghost, the lead scientist behind the quantum technology. His name was Dr. Eris Thorne, and he was currently hidden deep inside a heavily fortified compound nestled in a hostile, mountainous region where conventional military action was impossible. The intelligence was clear, the timeline was short, and the consensus in the room was grim: a surgical snatch. And grab mission was the only option. They had to get the scientist, or the world would watch helplessly as the network he had built unleashed chaos. In Captain Wallace's briefing room back at Coronado, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. The air smelled of coffee and the faint, metallic scent of cleaning solvent used on weaponry. Jake's team, SEAL Team 3, was assembled, their posture relaxed but their eyes sharp and focused. They were the best for this kind of high-risk, high-altitude infiltration, and they knew it. Captain Wallace stood before a large digital map displaying the target compound, his expression grave. He laid out the mission parameters, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the quiet of the room. It was incredibly dangerous, a mission with a near-zero margin for error. Infiltration, target acquisition, and extraction, all within a 4-hour window, in hostile territory, against a well-armed and technologically sophisticated enemy. "Here's the kicker," Wallace said, his tone dropping, pulling the focus of every man in the room into a tight, sharp point. He zoomed in on the digital schematic of the compound. Their entire communications network, their perimeter sensors, their internal security systems, every camera, every motion detector, it's all running on this new quantum encryption. We've thrown everything we have at it, and we can't make a dent. He paused, letting the full, crushing weight of that statement sink in. What that means for you is that we can't see them, but they can see us. We'll be going in completely blind. A muscle in Jake's jaw tightened. Going in blind was a death sentence. It violated every principle of special operations. "Almost blind," Wallace continued, his eyes sweeping over the team. "The NSA has assigned one of their top crypto analysts to this operation. This analyst has been working on a theoretical counter-measure for the past year. It's unproven. It has never been tested in a live environment, but it's all we've got." He looked directly at Jake. "This analyst will be your eyes and ears. They will be your only link to us, your only guide through that fortress. They will be running the decryption in real time from a forward command post, attempting to crack the encryption on the fly and feed you actionable intelligence. Your lives, gentlemen, will be in this person's hands. You will follow their instructions to the letter, without question or hesitation. Is that understood?" Jake and his team responded with a unified, "Yes, Captain." But inside, Jake felt a knot of apprehension. Trusting his life and the lives of his men to some unknown NSA analyst, a pencil pusher with a theoretical solution, went against every instinct he had. But an order was an order. The mission was the mission. The joint briefing was held in a sterile, secure container-ized room at a forward operating base in a country bordering the target nation. The air was tense, smelling of dust and jet fuel. Jake and his team, dressed in their lightweight tactical gear, filed into the room, their movements economical and precise. They were in mission mode now. The world narrowed down to the objective. They expected to see a senior, gray-haired NSA official on a large video screen, a disembodied voice from a secure bunker in Fort Meade. Instead, standing at the head of a massive, wrap-around console of glowing monitors, was Lydia Holt. The transformation was so absolute, so stunning, that for a moment Jake's brain refused to process the image. The unassuming, almost mousy clerk from the bar was gone. In her place stood a figure of pure, focused authority. She was dressed in functional, dark blue military fatigues, the kind worn by specialized technical personnel in the field. Her hair was pulled back in the same tight bun he'd seen in the news photo, and a sophisticated communications headset was settled around her neck. The soft, forgettable woman he had mocked was nowhere to be found. This woman was sharp, hard, and radiated an intensity that seemed to make the very air around her hum. The SEALs stopped dead in their tracks, a collective silent halt. Diaz, standing just behind Jake, let out a barely audible, "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." The air in the small room crackled with a profound and suffocating awkwardness. Jake felt a hot flush of mortification so intense it was physically painful, a burning heat that rose up his neck and spread across his face. He felt like he had been punched in the gut. Lydia turned from her console to face them. Her expression was entirely professional, her eyes cool and assessing. She gave no hint, not even the slightest flicker of recognition, of their previous encounter in the bar. Her focus was absolute. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice crisp, confident, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of command. "Glad you could make it. Please, have a seat." She gestured to the chairs arranged before her console. "The mission window is in 6 hours. We have a lot to cover, and no time to waste." For a second, Jake was paralyzed, his mind a chaotic swirl of shame, shock, and disbelief. Then, years of training, the ingrained discipline that had been forged in the crucible of Bud divided by S, took over. He forced his body to move, recovering his composure through sheer force of will. He stepped forward, clearing his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Ma'am," he said. The single word was a universe of meaning. It was an apology, a concession, a surrender. It was filled with a complex, bitter mixture of his own burning embarrassment, a dawning, terrifying awe, and a new, unfamiliar feeling of profound respect. He and his team took their seats, the clatter of their gear sounding like an intrusion in her sterile, digital domain. The power dynamic from the anchor's rest was not just reversed, it was obliterated. It had never existed. It had been a fiction he had created in his own arrogant mind. Jake struggled to reconcile the two versions of Lydia in his head, the quiet clerk and this formidable commander of secrets. He had to physically push down the hot wave of his personal shame, compartmentalize it, and lock it away. The mission was all that mattered. He forced himself to focus as she began to speak, and the world fell away. She broke down the most complex encryption he had ever heard of, with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. She explained the quantum mechanics not as abstract theory, but as a battlefield, pointing out the enemy's strengths, their weaknesses, the subtle flaws in their unbreakable code that she intended to exploit. She spoke of quantum tunneling and superposition as if they were terrain features, hills to be taken, valleys to be avoided. A new, grudging, and powerful respect began to form in Jake's mind, displacing the shame. This woman was a warrior, her mind a weapon more sophisticated than any rifle he had ever carried. Lydia, for her part, assessed them with a cool, detached professionalism. As she spoke, her eyes moved from man to man, gauging their reactions, their focus, their readiness. She wasn't looking at the men who had laughed at her. She was looking at SEAL Team 3, a tool she needed for a specific and dangerous task. The only thing that mattered to her was their competence. She needed to know if she could trust them to execute their part of the mission flawlessly when she guided them through the digital darkness. Her personal feelings were irrelevant, a luxury she could not afford. The lives of this team, the success of the mission, and the prevention of a global catastrophe rested on her analysis and their actions. The past was a ghost. The only thing that was real was the 6-hour countdown clock ticking silently in the corner of her main screen. The wind howled a mournful, ancient song across the rugged, moonless mountains of the hostile country, a landscape of jagged peaks and deep black shadows that seemed to swallow the very starlight. High above this brutal terrain, 6 shadows detached from the belly of a stealth transport plane, plummeting into the abyss. The freefall was a silent, cold ballet. There was no sound but the rush of air, a deafening whisper that filled the void. Jake's team, SEAL Team 3, executed a perfect halo jump, their bodies relaxed and controlled as they fell through the night. Their only connection to the outside world, their only guide in the suffocating darkness, was Lydia's voice, a calm, steady presence in their encrypted headsets, a thread of pure data in a world of physical chaos. They opened their chutes low, the black canopies blossoming for only a few precious seconds before they landed with the soft thuds of practiced professionals, miles from the target compound. They moved with the fluid, deadly grace of apex predators, melting into the rocky terrain, their forms indistinguishable from the shadows around them. Lydia's voice was their lifeline, a constant stream of precise, emotionless information. "Okay, Wrecker. I'm inside their outer perimeter network," she said, her voice as clear as if she were standing next to him. "Their sensor grid is a closed loop, but it has a predictable refresh cycle. I'm injecting a recursive algorithm that will feed them a ghost image of an empty landscape. It will hold for the next 12 minutes. Jake marveled at her control, at the casual way she spoke of defeating a multi-million-dollar security system. She wasn't just an analyst, she was a ghost, a digital phantom moving through the enemy's fortress without leaving a single trace. He and his team followed her instructions without question, their trust in her now absolute. She was their guide, their protector, their eyes in a place where their own were useless. Approaching the south wall, Jake whispered into his throat mic. "I see the camera array." "I see it too," Lydia replied instantly. "It's on a 7-second sweep. I'm looping the last 5 minutes of its feed now. The loop will be seamless, but it will degrade after 2 minutes. You have a 90-second window to cross the south wall, starting on my mark. Go." A small green light blinked on Jake's wrist, mounted display. The team surged forward, their movements a blur of silent efficiency. They scaled the wall and dropped into the compound's outer courtyard, the entire maneuver executed in under a minute. As they took cover behind a row of generators, Jake found himself thinking that his team was merely the physical manifestation of her will. She was the true infiltrator, the one kicking in the doors and disabling the alarms. They were just the hands that would carry out the task she had already made possible. They moved through the compound like specters, Lydia's voice guiding them through a maze of corridors and access tunnels. She disabled pressure plates, rerouted infrared sensors, and opened electronically locked doors seconds before they reached them. They finally reached their destination, a sterile concrete corridor leading to the scientist's laboratory. The air was cold and smelled of ozone. "Hold!" Lydia's voice came through, and for the first time, there was a new edge to it. A subtle tension that made the hairs on Jake's arms stand up. "My decryption is lagging. The internal network is fighting back. Something's wrong." Her words were still calm, but the cadence was faster. "They're running a counter-algorithm. It's adaptive. They knew we were coming. It's a trap. Get out now." Just as she screamed the warning, the world erupted in a cacophony of violence. Heavy steel shutters slammed down with the force of a guillotine, sealing both ends of the corridor with a deafening, final clang. Bright red alarm lights began to flash, painting the white walls in hellish strobes. Panels in the ceiling slid open, and enemy soldiers, clad in black body armor and armed with assault rifles, dropped into the hallway. A brutal, close-quarters firefight erupted. The narrow corridor became a kill box, the air filled with the deafening crack of gunfire, the whine of ricocheting bullets, and the smell of cordite. Muzzle flashes provided the only light, brief, violent strobes that illuminated scenes of pure chaos. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong. They were pinned down, taking heavy fire from both ends of the corridor, their primary extraction plan now utterly useless. A burst of static crackled in Jake's ear, followed by the chilling silence of a severed connection to main command. The enemy's counter-hack had been successful. They were alone, surrounded, and trapped. In Lydia's forward command post, a cramped, stifling tent filled with humming electronics, red lights flashed across her console like a frantic heartbeat. While her superiors at main command were scrambling, their voices a panicked chatter on a secondary channel as they tried to re-establish contact, Lydia was preternaturally calm. Her face, illuminated by the frantic red glow, was a mask of intense concentration. Her direct, quantum-linked channel to the seals, the one she had built herself, was still open. It was a secret back door, a connection no one else had. "Wrecker, talk to me." "Status?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the chaos in his helmet. Jake, taking cover behind a thick concrete pillar that was slowly being chipped away by enemy fire, shouted over the gunfire. "We're pinned. Multiple hostiles. Heavy armor. We're sitting ducks in a shooting gallery. No exit." "Not for long," she said, and her voice dropped into a lower, more intense register that sent a shiver down his spine. This was no longer the voice of an analyst. This was the voice of a fighter. Her fingers, which had been moving quickly before, became a blur, a pale storm dancing across 3 separate keyboards. This was no longer analysis. This was combat. She wasn't just breaking encryption, she was waging war. With a series of rapid, precise commands, she found a back door not into the security network, but into the compound's industrial control systems, the unglamorous digital plumbing that ran the facility itself. "Wrecker, listen to me," she commanded, her voice a sharp, clear signal in the storm of noise. "I'm going to vent the halon fire suppression system in the entire west wing of this facility. It will be a massive, noisy, and highly visible event. It will create a diversion and draw forces away from your position. On my mark, you are going to place a breach charge on the north wall of the corridor, midway down. My schematics show it's an unreinforced maintenance shaft. It's your only way out. It will lead you to the geothermal sub-level." Jake didn't hesitate. There was no time for questions, no room for doubt. Her voice was the only certainty in a world that had dissolved into chaos and death. "Give us a call sign, damn it." He barked into his mic, a moment of pure, battlefield pragmatism. "I'm not calling you Lydia in a firefight." A fraction of a second of silence passed, a single suspended heartbeat in the middle of the battle. "Your call sign is Oracle," she replied, her voice as cool and sharp as ice. "Mark, venting now." On the other side of the compound, massive pipes burst, and entire hallways filled with a deafening hiss as they were flooded with disorienting oxygen, depleting halon gas. Alarms blared, and enemy soldiers, confused and believing a massive fire had broken out, began to redeploy, their organized defense collapsing into chaos. The volume of fire in the corridor lessened slightly. "It's working, Oracle," Jake yelled, a new wild hope surging in his chest. "But we need a bigger hole. We need more cover to plant the charge." "Working on it," Oracle replied. Her fingers flew, rerouting a massive power surge from the geothermal plant deep below them directly into the corridor's lighting grid. The fluorescent lights flickered violently for a second, and then exploded in a shower of sparks and glass, plunging the corridor into near total darkness, punctuated only by the strobing red alarm lights and the enemy's panicked muzzle flashes. "Blow the wall, Wrecker, now!" Under the cover of the chaos and darkness, one of Jake's men scrambled forward and slapped a breaching charge onto the wall. He scurried back as Jake gave the command. The wall disintegrated in a cloud of concrete dust and shattered rebar. The team plunged through the jagged opening into the darkness below, just as a volley of enemy grenades sailed through the air and obliterated the position they had occupied only seconds before. They were bruised, battered, and disoriented, but they were alive. They were alive because of Oracle. The darkness was absolute, a thick, choking blanket of concrete dust and vaporized plaster. Jake coughed, the grit scraping his throat, as he and his team scrambled through the jagged hole in the wall. They landed hard in a narrow, steaming maintenance tunnel, the air hot and thick with the smell of sulfur and damp earth. Below them, the geothermal heart of the facility rumbled, a deep subterranean pulse. They were alive, but they were deep inside the beast, far from any known extraction point. "Oracle, you with us?" Jake gasped into his mic, his voice raspy. "Always, Wrecker," Lydia's voice replied, a beacon of pure, unwavering calm in the disorienting darkness. "I'm in the compound's engineering schematics. You're in the primary geothermal maintenance conduit. Follow it north. But be advised, they know you're down here. They're repositioning forces to intercept at every junction." Guided by her voice, they moved through the labyrinthine tunnels. It was a terrifying, claustrophobic chase. "Junction Alpha in 50 meters, Oracle would say. "Hostile team moving to cut you off. I'm overriding the steam pressure valves to your left. It will create a temporary barrier. Move on my mark." A deafening roar would erupt from a side tunnel, followed by the screams of scalded soldiers, and she would say, "Go, go now," and they would sprint through the intersection, the hot, wet steam clinging to their gear. She was not just their guide, she was their sword and shield, fighting a silent, invisible war on their behalf. Then came the breakthrough. "Wrecker, I have the asset." Lydia's voice crackled with a new intensity. "They're moving him. He's not in the lab anymore. They're taking him to a subterranean bunker, a panic room beneath the main command center. I can get you there. I've found an intercept point." She redirected them through a series of smaller, hotter, and more dangerous service tunnels, a path that didn't exist on any official schematic. They moved with a desperate, focused energy, their faith in her absolute. They cornered the scientist and his 2 bodyguards in a cramped, humid pump control room. The fight was brutal, short, and silent. They had their target, turning a catastrophic failure into an impossible, unbelievable success. "Asset is secure, Oracle," Jake panted, his lungs burning. "But we're out of options. How do we get out?" "I've been working on that," she replied. "There's an old, forgotten geothermal vent on the far side of the mountain, marked as inactive since the 1980s. It's your exit." She guided them on a final, grueling climb up a series of rusted ladders and crumbling concrete stairs. As they emerged from the vent into the cold night air, the ground shaking from the explosions now rocking the compound below, they heard the distinct, beautiful sound of rotor blades. A Black Hawk helicopter, not their original extraction bird, was hovering just yards away, its side door open. "I took the liberty of rerouting an asset from a nearby sector," Oracle's voice said, a hint of what might have been pride in her tone. "Your ride is here, gentlemen." As they flew away from the mountain, the compound now a distant, burning scar on the dark landscape, the SEALs were silent. They sat strapped into their seats, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving a profound sense of awe in its place. They were processing what had just happened. They hadn't been saved by a timely airstrike or another team of operators charging to the rescue. They had been saved by a woman in a tent miles away, a woman fighting a battle they couldn't see or comprehend, using weapons they didn't know existed. Jake looked at his men, their faces grimy and exhausted, but their eyes wide with a shared, unspoken understanding. Their world had been irrevocably altered. The formal debriefing room back at the main base was cold and sterile. Captain Wallace stood at the back, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Several high-ranking officials from different branches sat around the polished table, their expressions grim. The commander of the operation, a stern Air Force colonel with silver hair and cold blue eyes, stood at a podium. He was summarizing the mission, his voice a flat monotone. "The initial infiltration was flawless," the colonel said. "However, the mission was compromised by an adaptive enemy countermeasure, resulting in the ground team being trapped and all conventional communication links being severed." He paused and pressed a button. The audio logs from the firefight began to play, filling the silent room. Jake's own voice, desperate and strained, echoed from the speakers. "We're pinned. Multiple hostiles. Heavy armor. We're sitting ducks." Then came Lydia's voice, calm, clear, and authoritative. "Not for long." The room listened in, stunned silence as the audio played out, the sounds of her rerouting power, venting steam, and guiding them through the chaos. The colonel stopped the recording. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his cold eyes looking at each person in the room. "Standard doctrine in that scenario is to declare the ground team lost and scrub the asset. The fact that SEAL Team 3 and the asset are secure is due to the unprecedented and extraordinary actions of one individual." He nodded toward the side of the room. Lydia was standing there, quiet and unassuming in her simple fatigues, looking like she would rather be anywhere else. NSA analyst Holt, operating under the call sign Oracle, single-handedly neutralized the enemy's network advantage, created multiple diversions, established a new viable extraction path, and secured a new extraction vehicle, all in under 5 minutes, while under extreme pressure. He looked back at the assembled officers. Her actions were not in any manual. They were not part of any pre-approved plan. They were, in a word, extraordinary. Jake and his team, seated at the side of the room, listened, their faces set with a hard, unwavering conviction. They nodded in unison with the colonel's words, their silent, emphatic agreement, a more powerful testimony than any spoken words could be. The official praise, The cold, hard facts laid bare in the formal language of a debriefing validated the profound awe and boundless respect they now felt. They had been witnesses to something legendary. Later, in a cavernous hangar on the base, Lydia was overseeing the packing of her sensitive equipment. Her mobile command center was being carefully dismantled and loaded into hardened cases. Jake approached her alone, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He looked different. The easy arrogance, the swagger that had been his trademark, was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound humility that seemed to settle on him like a heavy cloak. "Lydia," he started, then corrected himself. "Miss Holt." He fumbled for the right words, the easy confidence he usually had with language completely deserting him. There's no excuse for how I acted at the bar. It wasn't just teasing, it was ignorance. It was arrogance." He looked her directly in the eye, forcing himself to meet her calm, intelligent gaze. "We think we're the tip of the spear, but we're blind. We're blind to the people who forge the steel, who sharpen the point, who aim it at the target. What you did up there, you didn't just save us. You won. I've never seen anything like it." He took a breath and extended his hand, an offering of peace and respect. "I'm Jake Riley, and I am deeply, truly sorry. And thank you." Lydia looked at his outstretched hand for a moment, then met his gaze. A small, genuine smile, the first one he had ever seen from her, touched the corners of her mouth. She shook his hand, her grip firm and confident. "We all have a part to play, Jake," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "You do your job, I do mine. That's all that matters in the end." She paused, a hint of wry humor glinting in her eyes. "But Oracle? A little dramatic, don't you think?" Jake let out a laugh, a real, unforced, and deeply relieved laugh. The immense, crushing tension that had existed between them since that night in the bar finally broke, shattering into 1,000 pieces and evaporating into the air of the hangar. In its place was the easy, unspoken camaraderie of those who have shared and survived a life-threatening experience. "It fit the moment," he said, his own smile finally reaching his eyes. "Thank you, Oracle." A month later, the final scene took place back where it all began, at the Anchor's Rest. The bar was just as loud, just as crowded, just as sticky. Jake and his team were at their usual table, but their energy was different. It was less boisterous, more contained, the quiet confidence of men who had been tested and had nothing left to prove. The heavy wooden door opened, and Lydia Holt walked in. She was dressed in her same unassuming civilian clothes, jeans and a simple sweater, looking for all the world like a librarian or an accountant who had just finished a long week. Jake spotted her immediately. A wide, genuine, and unguarded smile spread across his face. He stood up, the motion fluid and natural, and pulled out an empty chair at their table. "Lydia, get over here," he called out, his voice warm and welcoming. Diaz and the others looked up, and their faces broke into similar smiles of genuine pleasure. "The first round's on us, Oracle," Diaz said, raising his glass to her. Lydia smiled back, a relaxed, easy smile that reached her eyes. She walked over and joined them, setting her bag down and sliding into the offered chair. The conversation that followed was a comfortable, easy mix of friendly banter and professional shop talk, a seamless blend of two worlds that had once seemed so separate. They were no longer a SEAL team and a clerk. They were operators, colleagues, equals. The final shot is of the group, Lydia included, laughing together at something one of the SEALs said, a small island of hard, won mutual respect in the noisy, chaotic sea of the bar, a living testament to the fact that the most important warriors are not always the ones who carry the guns.